This antimicrobial use kind of reminds me of animal ID, because we've been talking about it for more than a decade, and some years it's a pretty hot topic and some years it's not. My current involvement is at last summer's AVMA meeting, a delegate wanted some wording changed relative to the use of antimicrobials in livestock. And the AVMA put together a task force called the Antimicrobial Use Task Force, the AUTF. And they have voting members, which are volunteers who serve on other committees and councils for the AVMA. And then they have non-voting members, and we the non-voting members, represent industry. And it's been a very interesting experience. I think we've all learned a thing or two, but I also have become very concerned about where our veterinary profession is leaning toward the future of antimicrobial use. So we'll kind of talk about that. So in the past, back in our grandparents' days, if the animal was sick, you treat it and you just go on with the next chore in hand. That's kind of the way it used to be, I think. And now, where are we? Well, in this task force, there's an astute woman in the group, and she says, you know, the public just doesn't want stuff in their food. And I thought, wow, that kind of says it all. You know, you can define stuff for yourself, but that's really part of it, is the public has become convinced that animals that end up on our plate that have never received an antibiotic are going to be better for you. And then in this task force, there are also some non-voting MDs, and they've reminded me something we've seen over and over is that the medical profession is sometimes as organized medicine, not just individual personalities, blames animal agriculture for the emergence of antimicrobial resistance in people. And we all can go and read the same papers, and it's funny how we come up with such different conclusions, because the data doesn't support that all of antimicrobial resistance has come from animal agricultural practices. But it reminds me that if I have one message, it's that we have done a really lousy job in animal agriculture of communicating to the MDs and to the public of what we do and why we do what we do. And unfortunately, I think it's almost too late to help turn the tide the other way. So in this task force, there was sort of this charge given to us, but really the underlying meaning was that under attack and needing to have some support in the AVMA to continue the current policy promoting use of over-the-counter antimicrobials and feed-grade antimicrobials. That's really what was under attack. And there were some people in that task force, some at the leadership level, who were going to be pretty happy if at the end of this 2-day meeting, here we are tackling this huge topic. I mean, it's really huger than animal ID, to be quite honest. They wanted us to be pretty happy to say, it's okay, we don't need those tools anymore in animal agriculture. It's okay, let's say that we don't support their use. And when we finally were able to be comfortable enough with each other around this table, which actually was an interestingly configured room, so the voting people sat around a table looking at each other, and then us second-class citizens were in the back of the room, where our hands could be ignored. But anyway, we finally got comfortable enough, and I really have to compliment one of the task force members when he just basically said, look, we're here to discuss over-the-counter and feed grade, and you really want us to say we don't need these anymore. And he said, as long as I'm a voting member, I can't say that. And so it was good. After really 2 days, it was finally out on the table, and the best conclusion that was drawn at that point in time is, guess what, guys? We need another meeting. So I can't completely speak. I guess that doesn't show up very well. Sorry, I thought yellow wasn't going to show up, and I made an error in judgment. I can't completely speak for where the AVMA proposed policy change is going to go, so I'll read this to you, because as a non-voting member, I don't get to see everything, so I have to spy a little bit. So in my spying of these 4 pages that I don't really have, there is some language that I think we could live with in animal agriculture, and the language is that the veterinarian should be involved in decision making for all use of antimicrobials in food producing animals. So we struggled with the terminology of how the veterinarian would be involved, and so it's expanded in here. But right now I could live with this policy if it becomes, this proposal if it becomes policy. So that's one place we're heading in the future. But I think as an industry, and I'm going to start with the sheep industry because it's easier for me, we need to right now get it out there on ASI's website, and anybody else who wants to listen. We need to tell our story, and we can be careful about how we tell it, but basically there are very few lambs that go to slaughter that have ever had an antimicrobial given to them. And the reason is because of their rearing environment. It's not because we have genetically resistant sheep yet. We need to get on that one. But the other thing is in our mature animals, it is easy for a producer to follow proper residue withdrawal times because we have mandatory ear tagging when those sheep move into commerce. So personally, on our farm, we don't tag everything at birth on the 2 operations, but we do tag animals that are treated. And that's the only way in our scale of operation that we can keep track of this animal's been treated. We also spray paint the date of their last treatment on their hip to help us. So if they got some color on them, you better go and look up what that ear tag is telling you. So mandatory ear tagging for the Scrapie program can actually be a benefit for management. In a way that I never thought it would be, as far as it's just sort of a no-brainer. Sounds stupid to be even saying this, but I think that's a message we should get out there. And then when you go and you read about what approved sheep antibiotics we have, it's very interesting because I'm going to share with you a website that you should take back and share with your sheep producers. But basically, let's use 3 common antibiotics that have sheep approval. First of all, procaine penicillin G. Well, it has over-the-counter approval, but at a dose rate that nobody in the country uses it, except my vet students. When you give them a paper exercise, they didn't realize that's not the right dose. Anyway, and so producers know that's not the right dose. So all of a sudden, even though they bought it at their farm store over-the-counter, they are into extra-label drug use because we need to give it at a different dose to be effective. So we are all of a sudden into the requirements of extra-label drug use. So again, we have veterinary involvement. Take 2 other sheep antibiotics, Ceftiofur, which is Naxel, and that's one that I think feedlots should generally have because it has no meat withdrawal time, and that's a prescription only, so it has veterinary involvement. Another one would be tilmycosin or Micotil, a very good drug for sheep with pneumonia or mastitis, and it's approved for use in sheep. And again, it's by veterinary prescription only. So it's kind of, to me, sort of like you own a car, and you know that it should regularly go in to have some maintenance done. But as the car owner, you decide how often that's going to happen, whether you have the oil changed or you change it every 3,000 miles, 5,000 miles, or you're kind of one of these risk takers and, oh, it's when I get around to it. Well, the sheep producer and the veterinary relationship, some of them are that every 3,000 mile. They're real closely allied, and some are a little looser arrangement. And that's a harder thing to mandate. That's a harder thing to control. Just like I can't make you change the oil in your car, even though you should have 5,000 miles ago. And so, but I can suggest that it has been a good approach that so many of these drugs do require veterinary involvement. So again, as an industry, we haven't communicated this very well to our sheep producers, and we sure haven't communicated it to other professional organizations and the public. And in the sheep industry, we have a sheep safety and quality assurance program. It's just undergone a revision. The new one is, I think it's up on the website now. Personally, I think because this is an educational tool that teaches people a lot in a very simple, straightforward way about proper antimicrobial use, personally I wish the packers would make it mandatory like they have in the hog industry. And that would be a stronger selling point to the public that, yeah, we are being careful with what drugs go into our animals. We aren't quite ready to go there yet. as an industry, but I think we're getting closer. So these are things that every industry and people in this room can probably come up with more examples, but we sure need to do a better job communicating it. So, you know, Katie Korek doesn't do it. I mean, she went, you guys have read all that, but it was kind of interesting. I was with a hog industry representative the day that story was supposed to air, and she was telling me the inside scoop about how they'd go to a farm and want to take some footage, but they didn't like what they saw at that farm. It didn't depict things bad enough, so they had to go to another farm. And anyway, to make a long story short, I think they went to 8 farms, you know, to only air a few. So we have to keep trying. Okay, so anybody's interested in more information on the Sheep Safety and Quality Assurance Program, just go to ASI's website and we'll find it there. And then this website is very valuable for sheep producers, and they really ought to spend some time on it. So if you go to this website, there's a little menu drop-down bar, and you pick sheep or goats, or you could pick small ruminants. And I can't do it in here without paying money or having a password, so I didn't do that. But anyway, say you pick sheep, and then you have different ways you can look at it. So I like to look at things this fastest way I can anymore, or maybe I should say the most efficient. And there's 42 drugs been approved for sheep that show up on this website. And you click on that particular drug that you're interested in, that list of 42, and it tells you right away, a nice one-page readable format, not being marketed. You know, well, I was done reading that one then, so I went back to the next choice in antimicrobials, and there it was, you know, the proper dose that it had been approved to be given, the indications for use, a withdrawal time if it was used that particular way. And so the drug company, we have so many drug company name changes now and takeovers, that was helpful. So this is a website that I really think we should put as links and explain why people should look at that. Because if you were to just be given this website, you wouldn't get very switched on. You'd have no idea how informative this website could be. So both sheep and goat producers might not realize that there's a lot of requirements in how and when and why you use antimicrobials, and so I won't spend a lot of time going through that right now because I think all of us in this room know them. But one thing a practitioner shared with me, I thought he was wrong, but when he pulled the language out of the compliance guide for extra label use of medicated feed for minor species, I realized that he was a darn good student still today, as he was right. And so he was showing me, for example, feeding aureomycin and sulfa to pregnant ewes at risk for chlamydia and chlamydophilia and Campylobacter species. That actually, if you follow the language in this particular compliance guide, that is a legal thing, A-L-E-G-A-L thing to do. Whereas I would have thought the way they were doing it, it was illegal. But sure enough, as a good practitioner should, he had gone to the language and found out that, yep, we could feed this, we could help these sheep, we could help these producers, and we could still be legal. So again, another thing, we should link and remind people what this is all about. So extra label use of medicated feed for minor species, we're darn lucky. We have some wiggle room because the major species do not have wiggle room. You can't do extra label feed for major species, for instance cattle and hogs, and I think there are feed mills that aren't aware of this compliance guide. Okay, so this is kind of a busy slide, and maybe we just say one thing. We do have more drugs approved for sheep and goats than we might realize. And I just am making my points again that we have got to do a better job telling our story. The goat situation, a little less productive as far as what antimicrobials they have approved. So they have 2 different manufacturers approved for Naxel or Ceftiofur, and then neomycin sulfate. Not sure they have any other antimicrobials approved, but I've got to go back to the website to know for sure. And everything else would be extra label drug use. Now, I would challenge us all to go to a goat farm today, and we'll find more than those 2 drugs there. And so I'm a little worried about that, and I think that this organization and a lot of other organizations could help our goat industry. The goat industry, as long as I've known it, has really not just been one single industry. You know, we had a big Angora goat industry for a long time. It still exists in a much smaller scale. The biggest, and we have a dairy goat industry, and it's pretty steady. But the biggest numbers that are growing are meat goats. And I don't know if it's just Minnesota or it's countrywide, but boy, do we have people buy meat goats that don't have a clue what they're doing. And so I know antimicrobial use is not very front and center in their vocabulary as well. It's a wonderful place to take vet students because we can usually find, if you go to 5 farms, we could find all the major diseases. A lot of indiscriminate selling going on in that industry. But because of the numbers are projected to continue to grow, we need to probably get some good educational material out to that group so that they don't get targeted or become a black eye. And we don't want the public or somebody like Katie Korek lumping this part of the meat goat industry in with other more well-established, well-informed industry groups. So I think that we've got to do something there, and the sooner the better. You know, build on the SQA and make a goat QA. It would be a very well-received tool. I am concerned that we have representation, continue to have representation at the AVMA. I'm not really a fan of those political summer meetings, but I think it's going to be important that we monitor what is discussed by the delegates and possibly gets changed. I think it's important that we stay involved at the executive board level because the executive board, I'm just going to be real candid, tends to be composed of primarily small animal practitioners. And so we do have a small animal practitioner on this task force. She's a retired cat veterinarian, and it didn't matter how you tried to explain to her why historically not every antimicrobial had been a prescription only use for food producing animals. She seemed to just think that was wrong and that was the genesis of the problem. And I got to thinking about, you know, when you take your cat to the vet and you get a prescription antibiotic or antimicrobial, excuse me, usually you get a call a few days later from that clinic asking how the cat's doing. And usually the cat's doing well. That's the last contact. And so if there are leftover drugs, there's nobody, again, policing that those drugs don't go into the next sick adult in that household or their friend, or how those leftover drugs are disposed of if they're never needed to be used. And so I was not following her rationale of why prescription only was going to be the answer. And I just felt like within our own profession, we had some real challenges. So it's going to be a struggle.